everybody, so today we're going to be doing a video about biochemistry. So this is just an intro video of biochemistry, and then at the end we're going to introduce the four macromolecules. And in subsequent videos, you guys can watch each of the macromolecules in detail and more about them. So to begin with, we're going to look at the atom. And the atom consists of various different components, and this is just a very simplistic view of the atom. And the atom consists of orbits which contain electrons, and electrons are negatively charged, and these orbits are orbiting around a structure called the nucleus that contains protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons that are negatively charged. Now, intramolecular forces are forces that are going to be within a molecule. So these forces are usually going to be chemical bonds, right? So atoms form a stable attraction to one another, and those are called chemical bonds. So the first type of bond is an ionic bond, and this forms between atoms that have lost or gained electrons to become charged. So in this case, the atoms that have lost or gained electrons are now called ions. So ions of opposite charge, meaning one is going to be positive and the other is going to be negative, are going to be strongly attracted to one another, and this attraction will lead to that ionic bond. So in this case, this atom right over here has lost or transferred an electron to this atom right over here. Now both of them are now ions. This is the positive ion, called otherwise known as a cation. And this is the negatively charged ion, which is called an anion. And so this opposite attraction, or this opposite charge, allows for an attraction that leads to an ionic bond. We also have covalent bonds, which form when atoms share one or more pairs of valence electrons. So, for example, if you consider the simplistic example of hydrogen, in this case, this isn't a perfect example of that because these are not hydrogen molecules, or sorry, hydrogen atoms, but basically the formation of molecular hydrogen from two hydrogen atoms is very similar to this, except the electron number is very different. In that case, each hydrogen atom would give one electron, and then that would result in the sharing of their two electrons between each of the atoms. And basically, if you just kind of erase these other electrons and just consider these two, this would be a hydrogen molecule where two hydrogen atoms come together, each one gives its one electron, and now both of their valence shells are being occupied, or their octet rule is being satisfied, and they're sharing those two electrons between the two atoms. Now, what we're going to look at now is the strength of the covalent bond. So the strength of the covalent bond really depends on something called the electronegativity. So the electronegativity is basically how involved are the atoms in sharing that electron pair. In other words, electronegativity is just a measure of an atom's attraction for additional electrons, or its ability to obtain more electrons. So here's a diagram of the periodic table, and over here we can see that as you go from left to right on the periodic table, we have an increasing electronegativity. Same goes for when we're going from the bottom upwards in the periodic table, there's an increase in electronegativity. So if I draw a general trend of the electronegativity trend usually runs like this. So the color isn't so perfect because it's red as well, but that's the general trend of the electronegativity. It's going from the bottom here all the way up. And what does that mean? Well, elements that are right over here of the periodic table, right near this top head of the arrow, are going to be the most electronegative compared to these ones. So you might have heard that fluorine is the most reactive, and that's usually because it has such a high electronegativity that makes it very reactive. So that is the general trend of electronegativity. It spans through this arrow. So because of electronegativity, we get polar covalent bonds, or in other words, what happens is although all covalent bonds involve the sharing of valence electrons, they differ widely in the degree of sharing that's going to take place. Now, the more electronegative an atom is, the more strongly it's going to attract electrons, right? Obviously, the more higher you are over here of the periodic table, the more higher you are over here, the more electronegative you are, and that's how strongly you're going to attract electrons. And it's influenced by the atomic number and distance between the valence electrons as well. But basically, what happens is that the unequal sharing of electrons between two atoms with different electronegativities results in a polar covalent bond. So the best example of this would be HCl, right over here. So hydrogen, if we go back to this slide right over here, it has an electronegativity of 2.1, whereas chlorine has an electronegativity of 3.0. And you can see on which ends they lie on the periodic table, meaning that chlorine is very close to this arrow right over here, the tip of the arrows, right, making it very electronegative, and hydrogen being near the tail of the arrow, and it's therefore going to be it's not going to be very electronegative. So when they form a covalent bond, there's going to be this unequal sharing of electrons, where chlorine is going to have a stronger hold or attraction for electrons, and that gives it a partial negative charge because it's experiencing or handling electrons more than hydrogen over here is. So that's going to give it a partial negative charge, and this is just the delta sign, which just means partial negative. That's why we have the negative right over here. So this just means it has a partial negative charge, and the hydrogen, on the other hand, has a partial positive charge. So we can also have nonpolar covalent bonds, and these are between two nonmetal atoms that have the same electronegativity, and that's why they're going to have an equal sharing of the bonding electron pair. So if we look at oxygen, for example, or the oxygen molecule O2, right, it's going to have nonpolar bonds because, first of all, the two atoms that are involved in the molecule are the same. Right, so the electronegativity difference in this case, you can imagine, would be 0 because both of them are exactly the same. And since they're exactly the same, there's an equal sharing of the bonding electron pair because they're having the same pull on the electrons. So discussing nonpolar and polar covalent bonds and just looking at those atoms, we can then focus on intermolecular forces. And intermolecular forces are forces of attraction that are going to be between molecules. And these are also known as van der Waals forces. And they're basically very weak attractions between two molecules or parts of molecules when they're close together. So it's just looking at these interactions between molecules themselves. So the first intermolecular force that we're going to look at is the London dispersion forces, or the London forces. And these are going to be happening in any substance, right? So any substance can really do this. And it's just a temporary attractive force that results from electrons in two adjacent atoms occupying positions that make the atoms form temporary dipoles. So in this case, we can see that the positioning of the electrons is in such a way that it's going to have these partial or these very temporary attractive forces to the other atoms, just because of the way that the orientation of the electrons happens in these two adjacent atoms. So that allows them to form temporary dipoles. Dipole-dipole forces are going to be when dipoles are going to interact with each other. So these are going to be usually between polar molecules because polar molecules are going to contain these dipoles. So molecules move around so as to always be making electrostatic interactions between the negative end of one dipole and the positive end of another dipole. So we can see right over here, we looked at HCl being a polar having a polar covalent bond where one side is partially positive and one's partially negative. So when a bunch of HCl molecules are kind of floating around or together in the same area, two adjacent molecules of HCl are going to come near each other, and the partial negative charge on the chlorine in one molecule is going to interact with the partial positive charge on the other molecule in the hydrogen, and that's going to form this dipole-dipole force. And we can see over here the special other intermolecular force that's occurring, and that is called a hydrogen bond. Well, the hydrogen atom is going to basically be bonded to a very strongly electronegative atom in one molecule, and it can become strongly an electronegative atom in strongly attracted to another electronegative atom in another molecule. So what do we mean by that? Well, the best example to look at over here is water. So here we can see this hydrogen is bonded to this oxygen right over here. So usually hydrogen bonding happens between hydrogen and one of these three molecules: fluorine, oxygen, and nitrogen. And sometimes chlorine can also be an exception, like the case over here. And so a way that I like to remember it is that if hydrogen is having FON, F-O-N, then that means that it's going to be in a hydrogen bond. So that's going to cause there to be a hydrogen bond. So in this case, we can see this hydrogen is bonded to one of the atoms in FON, oxygen. So that allows it to hydrogen bond with oxygen in another one of the same molecule, right? So here another water molecule comes along, right? And this hydrogen is going to be attracted to the very electronegative atom in that other molecule being oxygen. So this hydrogen is going to be strongly attracted to the oxygen in this other water molecule. So here is the increasing strength trend that we see between London forces, dipole forces, and hydrogen bonds. As you go down, you can see that the strength of them increases, and hydrogen bonds are significantly very strong. On their own, they're not that strong or whatever if there's like one, but collectively they do lend to stability, and it'll allow for molecules to have some type of structure.